Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekha Chariwag, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. Today we are going to discuss a module on women's movement, social reform and nation that comes under the paper Sociology of Gender, which is coordinated by me. In this module, we are going to discuss the whole experience of colonial rule, especially with regard to its relationship to the women's question. Further, looking into the debates of nationalism and its interlinkages with the women's movement in India. Further, we will also problematize this whole idea about social reform and also examine its linkages with women's movement and making and shaping of the Indian nation. Women's movement, social reform and nationalist movement. The module has three main sections and subsections under it. The sections are Introduction, Section 2 Colonial Rule and Women's Question, Section 3 Nationalism and Women's Movement. Section 1 Introduction. Social reforms in India does not mean in the same way as it generally meant in the West. Indian social reform was a praxis of acceptance of newer Western ideology and seeking solace in the Hindu belief. This kind of practice started with the educated upper class and percolated down to the lower caste and lower class. One of the ideals of the reform movement was to do away with the social evils of the society, and Bhakti movement emerged as a solution to it. But Vijay Nambiar argues that Bhakti movement has failed to heal the disease condition of the Indian social system, as the ideals of the Bhakti movement also in some way was based on the Hindu meanings of life. Nambiar further argues that furthermore, in their attempt to rationalize the Hindu religion, these reformers sought to distinguish the essential aspects of Hinduism from the non-essential ones, to separate the pristine religion from the subsequent accretions. Till the First World War, social reforms in India can be divided into three stages. The first stage was marked by an effort on part of the individuals to order their personal lives in accordance with the standards adopted from the West. The archetype of such individual revolt and reform was Raja Ram Mohan Roy. The onset of the second stage was marked by the formation of subnational groups and the growth of a new desire for unity between the scattered and culturally diverse social groups. Politically, this was a period when the first glimmer of nationalism appeared on the subcontinent. With the turn of the century, social reform came to mean a regeneration of the traditional spirit of the nation, a regeneration founded on religious revival and cultural xenophobia. The subsequent sections will carve out the detail of the colonialism, nationalism and social reforms and the women's question. Feminist reaction to social reform and nationalist movement. The terms nationalism, colonialism and women's movement point towards the idea of social reform. Social reforms or the Renaissance is the period when all the prejudices in the Indian society were challenged and meted out. This invariably brings to our mind the names of some of the social reformers of the period in our mind. Tanika Sarkar and Sumit Sarkar, in the introduction of their book Women and Social Reform in Modern India, argue that the colonial social reforms are routinized part of Indian school, colleges and university syllabi, and that these social reformers generally belong to the upper caste sections. The scholars further argue that little is known about the social reforms amongst Muslims of the lower caste. Thus, the social reforms were basically an upper class phenomena. With this background, two has to be understood. First, the causes of the emergence of the reforms and the use of women as a carrier of nationalist ideals. Hence, this module talks about women's movement, social reform and a nationalist movement. To quote Sarkar, Sumit Sarkar and Tanika Sarkar, the reasons for the emergence of social reforms are a new colonial education imposed by the state and colonial missionaries that altered and modernized the traditional perspectives, the new religious movements that revived and consolidated older humanitarian impulses, lastly, the newly educated who wanted to save the weak and the helpless. Thus, the impact of particular time and space resulted in the formation of the young educated men, specifically belonging to the upper caste and upper class, to think deeply about the then existing social problems. These social reformers, mostly men and few women, trained in Western education but influenced by traditional scriptures, wanted to do away with the social evils. The influence of traditional scriptures came as social reform, were influenced by the ideals of nationalism. Nationalism emerged as a reaction to colonial rule, and as a result there was a tendency to go back to everything that was thought to be indigenous. The idea was to contest everything that was Western. It is at this juncture that the question of women comes in the nationalist and reforms ideals. The reformers wanted to put an end to the social evils, and the same reformers who were nationalist leaders created the idea of homogeneous Indian women. As a result, women were used as a symbol of Indian tradition and culture and as a carrier of nationalist ideology. This women's movement in India started in 1920, fueled by the 19th century social reform movement. In the process, these English-educated nationalists not only voiced out against the then prevalent social evils like sati, child marriage, but also promoted widow remarriage. This kind of a movement is generally labeled as emancipatory. However, the feminists have questioned the way the reform leaders and nationalists have dealt with the women's question. Feminists have pointed out how colonialism, nationalism, and women's movement are important in understanding the making of the Indian middle-class woman and reproduction of patriarchal structures. The nationalist ideals are responsible for creating a homogeneous category of Indian women. Following sections shall highlight as and why clubbing of all women under one homogeneous category is problematic. Argues Samita Sen that the women's movement grew during the period of high nationalism and freedom struggle, which further molded the contours of the movement. She further argues that the constitutional guarantee of equal rights for women and universal adult suffrage in independent India as two of his major contributions. However, she further argues that these guarantees did little to bring about social and material change in the lives of most Indian women. This chapter therefore questions and critically analyzes the nationalist ideologies, what led to those ideologies, the impact of those ideologies, and how the existing societal norms impacted the ideologies of social reform. Therefore, to understand the complex interface of how nationalist movement and social reform is related to women's movement, the concept of nationalism, colonialism, patriarchy, and women's movement has to be understood. Colonialism. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, colonialism, a Western political economic phenomena whereby various European nations explored, conquered, settled, and exploited large areas of the world. The age of modern colonialism began about 1500 following the European discoveries of a sea route around Africa's southern coast 1488 and of America 1492. With these two events, sea power shifted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic and to the emerging nation states of Portugal, Spain, Dutch Republic, France, and England. By discovery, conquest, and settlement, these nations expanded and colonized throughout the world, spreading European institutions and culture. Oxford Dictionary of Sociology defines colonialism as establishment of political authority over areas of Africa, Asia, Australia, Latin America as colonies. Patriarchy. Encyclopedia Britannica defines patriarchy, a hypothetical social system in which the father or the male elder has absolute authority over the family group. By extension, one or more men, as in a council, can exert absolute authority over the community as a whole. Building on the theories of biological evolution developed by Charles Darwin, many 19th century scholars sought to form a theory of unilinear cultural evolution. This hypothesis, now discredited, suggested that human social organization evolved through a series of stages. Animalistic sexual promiscuity was followed by matriarchy, which in turn was followed by patriarchy. Consensus among modern anthropologists and sociologists is that while power is often preferentially bestowed on one sex or the other, patriarchy is not the cultural universal it was thought to be. However, some scholars continue the term in general sense for descriptive, analytical, and pedagogical purposes. Women's movement. The Oxford Dictionary of Sociology, the term women's movement refers to the mobilization of women around the project of changing and improving the position in society. It is often used interchangeably with women's liberation movement to describe the second wave of feminism from 1970s onwards, the first being 19th and early 20th century feminism culminating in the struggle for votes for women. Nationalism. Oxford Dictionary of Sociology defines nationalism as sentiment, aspiration, and consciousness. All are terms applied to what constitutes nationalism or the valuation of nation-state. Sati, on the other hand, is a traditional practice of self-immolation of a Hindu widow on her husband's funeral pyre. The practice has stopped during the social reform and Indian freedom struggle in the 19th century. Section 2. Colonial Rule and Women's Question. Talking about colonialism, nationalism, and women's movement today is a discussion of a particular time and space. Therefore, in such a study, it is very important to know about existing social relation of that particular time. Kumkum Sangari and Sudesh Ved thus argue for a feminist historiography. According to Sangari and Ved, the feminist historiography rethinks of historiography as a whole and discuss the idea of women as something to be framed by a context in order to be able to think of gender difference as both structuring and structured by the wide set of social relations. Mrilanani Sinha explains that this is not mere inclusion of women or participation of women in historical movements. Rather, it is a methodology of questioning of power equations of all historical reconstructions. Thus argues Mrilanani Sinha that feminist historiography realizes that all aspects of reality is gendered and the experiences of gender changes according to race, class, caste, nation and sexuality. An Indian woman is not a homogeneous category, rather it is a complex intersection of caste and class. Therefore, the experiences of patriarchy experienced by women across different caste and class are fairly varied complex. Sangari and Ved argue that structures of patriarchy are entangled with modes of social subjugation. For example, the control of sexuality of upper caste women is one of the most important tools of maintaining caste endogamy. Therefore, the upper class women cannot be placed at par with lower class women. Hence, the ideal Indian woman created based on the nationalist ideals have to be critically analyzed. Undoubtedly, the women in India had a little self-existence as independent individuals. But in nationalism and emergence of the nationalist ideas that had tried to constitute it in some sense, the male nationalist leaders, enriched with modern education and liberal ideas, had thought about equality of women and abolition of social evils like sati. The overwhelming preoccupation with women's question began only in the 19th century social reform movement. The initial stages of discussion on women's issues started in Bengal and Maharashtra. Sharmila Rege argues that literature on the nation and nationalism had rarely addressed the question of gender. Rege argues that it is only the feminist writings of the 90s that the history has been rewritten in a way to highlight women's active role in Indian nationalism and the cultural agenda that came to be imposed upon women. These writings have highlighted that the importance of women not only as biological producers of sons but also carriers of cultural values have reconstituted and reproduced patriarchal structures in colonial India. The body of women became important for controlling it, meant keeping the cultural values intact, and as Rege argues, women became the sexed objects who needed to be saved from outsiders. Therefore, Kumkum Sangari and Sudesh Ved, in their introduction to the famous book Recasting Women, question, argue and debate about the regulation and reproduction of patriarchy across class and caste. Sangari and Ved argue that working of patriarchy in the present is actually determined by the social and cultural processes that women's question has undergone under the nationalist leaders during the colonial period. For example, land pattern and tenure had changed under the colonial rule, and it is imperative to understand how land systems had looked into the women's question. Sangari and Ved has therefore highlighted how the land systems had affected women belonging to different sections differently. The following points will show how the colonizers produced differential land question and how it had a more negative impact on women. Men had ownership of individual land rights and women just had secondary rights owing to their subordinate relation to men, and this was further amplified during the colonial rule. Landowning groups were empowered with land relations and market relations. Therefore, this further marginalized the tenants and agricultural laborers. Hence, the lower caste women were further marginalized owing their lower position to their fathers, brothers, husbands, sons, and men in any other relation. The colonizers modified the rules on land settlement, and hence women who had little access to land had to depend on men. The customary laws were codified, which made custom law and gave jurisdictional sanction to certain practices regarding marriage, succession, and adoption. Sangari and Ved argues that this codification of the customary law has led to the disadvantage of all Hindu women, whether rural or urban. This formulation showcases how creating and accepting Indian women as one homogeneous category is problematic. These laws were more discriminating towards women than men, and as a result, the already marginalized women were further marginalized. This highlights how gender relations work with the intersections of caste and class. Therefore, the homogeneous category of the Indian women created by the nationalist and reform leaders based on the upper caste, upper class Hindu ideology is problematic. The colonial laws are equally responsible in strengthening the patriarchal structures. For example, the custom of Kareva, a form of widow remarriage practiced in colonial Haryana. The codification of this customary practice, Kareva, reinforced patriarchal structures. It brought the lower caste women under the Brahminical fold. Such a practice was doubly disadvantaged as it turned the Brahminical patriarchal rules into laws for the already suffering upper caste women and also included lower caste women under his ambit. The result of this male inheritance over control of property. Kareva was practiced as women were important in agriculture, as agricultural laborer, as inability to pay dues were related to marital status of a man, that a single man or widower were not expected to perform agricultural duties. The importance of women in the agrarian economy made marriage an economic necessity. Therefore, the prospective bride had to be physically strong so that she could carry out agricultural duties properly. This made possible the existence of bride price in Haryana. However, as bride price was related to shame, it would not raise the status of women. Rather, it placed a contrary situation of bride price and dowry existing together. Section 2.1 Social Reform, Nationalist Movement and Women's Question. As already mentioned in the earlier sections, as the social reforms and nationalist movement in India were influenced by the Western ideology of equality but tried to base it on the Vedic literature. As the nationalist leaders generally belonged to the upper caste Hindus and trained and exposed to Western ideals of equality and justice, it came natural to them to place women's question in that context. Therefore, the reform leaders are seen placing women's question in the context of culture and tradition. This emphasis on the culture and tradition was based on nationalist ideals. For example, reform organizations like Arya Samaj found common ground in it and legitimized the Vedic age. Sangari and Ved claim that this legitimation of Vedic knowledge is an upper class phenomena. They further maintain that this valorization of the Vedic knowledge was done at the cost of the peasant women and other marginalized women. The question of women as dealt by the nationalist leaders shall be understood by using conceptual position of two scholars. First, the concept of Bhadra Mahila by Sumanta Banerjee and public sphere and private sphere by Partha Chatterjee. Bhadra Mahila by Sumanta Banerjee. The nationalist movement therefore did not take into account the different sections of the Indian women. Women's questions of the nationalist movement therefore meant that the women question of the upper class Hindu women. Sangari and Ved argue was the time for the educated middle class to form the Hindu and the Indian woman as against the Western woman. This was mainly the work of the upper caste English educated middle class men who had formulated the idea of Indian women. The construction of Bhadra Mahila in Bengal is one such example where the idea of Indian woman was created. Sumanta Banerjee argues that to create sharper difference within the class, new educated middle class women were placed in contrast to the women of the lower economic position, as thus appeared the Bhadra Mahila as opposed to the marginalized lower class women. As a result, the brunt of such ideals was felt by all sections of women at varying levels and degree. Moreover, the emerging industrial sector also had its impact on the lower class women. Because of it, they had not only lost their traditional occupations and found little opportunities in the new textile and jute mills as they were unskilled laborers. Thus, Bhadra Mahila could be explained basically in Bengal where the upper class, modern education and rich men wanted the women of the house to be educated and wanted them to behave in a particular way. This ideology was basically influenced by the Victorian ideology. Public sphere and private sphere by Partha Chatterjee. Partha Chatterjee presents before us a dichotomy of Western ideals and ideals of indigeneity of the nationalist leaders. According to him, the central problem of the nationalist leaders was a problem of modernization based on Western ideals and simultaneously retaining the national identity. This was basically done with the motive of gaining independent nationhood. Chatterjee argues that nationalist leaders dealt with the binary of tradition and modernity by distinguishing the spiritual from the modern and the inner from the outer. This allowed the newly English educated nationalists to imitate the West in the outer space or the material sphere, but retaining the inner sphere or the spiritual space as an uncolonized space where the indigenous Indianness had to be located. Chatterjee claims that this dichotomy of Western and Indian were related to the socially prescribed roles for men and women. Men are socially supposed to do work outside home and the women inside home, and this gendered space of public space shared by men and private space shared by women was used as a space of negotiation by the nationalist leaders. As a result, women, as custodians of the inner private spiritual space, were considered as the embodiments of essentialized Indianness. The Kumkum Sangari and Sudesh Ved argued that this re-articulation of the Indian woman for the claims of nationalist leaders provided the base for modernizing the existing indigenous patriarchal structures. Sangari and Ved claimed that different women emancipation ideals were related to national liberation, Renaissance in 19th century. Suresh Sangari and Ved also termed this as recovery of the traditional Indian woman. Thus, Partha Chatterjee's concept of public sphere in terms of men and modernization and private sphere in terms of women and indigenous spiritual sense helps one to understand nationalism and the women's question. Section 3. Nationalism and women's question. This section would be critical understanding of the formation of the idea of modern Indian woman. Basically, this section would sum up the nationalist movement, social reform and women's movement. Maitri Chaudhary argues that Indian nationalism was a cultural critique of colonialism and an assertion of national culture. The category of Indian women was created by the nationalist ideals. Indian women's movement was started by the nationalist men, unlike women's movement and other women's movement. However, the way the nationalist leaders dealt with the women's question were later questioned by the feminists. Maitri Chaudhary argues that, like modernity and capitalism, feminism too entered India through colonialism. Feminists argue that it is necessary to look critically at the women's question because it forms a collective identity of Indian women and consciousness of women's movement. Maitri Chaudhary argues how the nationalist movement and later Indian state imagined the role of Indian women. The ways are women as agents and recipients of development, women's political participation in the nation as equal citizen of a state that does not discriminate on the basis of gender, women as emblems of national culture. The nationalist period restated the Hindu ideology. Women were compared and referred to as Gargis and Maitris of the Vedas. Gender was always linked to religion. The literature on Dalit feminism highlights and illustrates how gender roles are assumed by religion. The marker of Hindu identity was used to form Indian women during the nationalist movement. The reform societies like Arya Samaj went back to Hindu ideology and Vedas to construct the idea of women. The writings of the reform leaders address a geographical territory of India as Bharat Mata, the depiction of which is generally in the form of goddess and hence religious. Another example of such a case when the region was used to identify the rights of the women is the famous Shah Bano case. Muhammad Ahmad Khan versus Shah Bano Begum, a maintenance lawsuit in India, is usually referred to as a Shah Bano case. A Shah Bano, a 60-year-old Muslim woman, was divorced by her husband in 1978. Religion has therefore always been important in the formation of women's question and the basis of which nationalist movement. But only criticizing the nationalist ideologies and finding loopholes in the reform movement will not help. Rather, it is important to question how and when these ideologies made their way into the women's question. Feminists criticize the nationalist leaders and reform leaders for trying to create one homogeneous Indian woman who were made to behave as the carrier of Indian tradition and culture. Feminists have argued that the ideals of reform leaders to abolish child marriage, sati, kulin, polygamy and to introduce widow remarriage were all the issues of the upper caste and upper class women. However, the feminists have acknowledged the fact that the most positive outcome of the reforms are that they shaped women's entry into the public sphere. But these reforms ideals started by the nationalist movement and followed by the upper caste and upper class women starting from Pandita Ramabai to Tarabai Shinde formed the basis of women's movement in India. The protest by the upper caste and upper class women against the Mandal Commission also proves that the upper caste and upper class emancipation project, which was started by the nationalist leaders, had failed to actually address the women's question. Moreover, this proves that one Indian homogeneous woman cannot address the exploitation and oppression faced by women belonging to different sections. In this module, we have developed a critical understanding of the formation of the idea of modern Indian woman, and we have problematized the concept of a unified singular category of Indian women. Further, we have also analyzed the relationship between nationalism, colonialism and women's movement in India. And in doing so, we have developed and explored alternative ideologies of nationalism. By doing these alternative ideologies of nationalism, we have drawn on feminist theorization of nationalism. So in all, this module gives us a critical understanding about how the whole idea of Indian nation, in that context, the idea of Indian womanhood was formed. Thank you.